Welcome to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 takes a look at the global marketplace and the importance of doing international business, particularly for Canadian companies. So if we go back to our mosaic, we're really talking about one of the external environments that businesses operate within. And this is the international market. So doing business abroad and at the same time having businesses that are located outside of Canada doing business in Canada and what that means to Canadian businesses. So this purpose of this chapter is really to discuss the potentials and the challenges of doing business internationally. So some of our learning outcomes, we're going to take a look at why global trade is important to Canada and look at different ways that we can measure the value of global trade. We'll take a look at why nations trade, why it makes sense for nations to trade, and take a look at some of the common markets or economic communities that have developed over the last 20 or 30 years. We'll take a look then at ways that Canadian businesses can enter the global marketplace. Some are low risk, some are high risk. So we'll look at the different options for Canadian businesses to get involved in doing business internationally. And we'll also take a look at some of the things that governments are doing to promote trade throughout the world, and also take a look at some of the threats of doing business internationally. And as always, we'll conclude the chapter with some trends in the global marketplace. Canada has always relied on international trade, particularly with the United States. Most of our exports go to the United States, and exports are when Canadian business sells goods and services to another country. As well, our largest importing partner is the United States, and importing is when we buy goods and services from another company. However, more today than ever before, it's important that all businesses have a global vision. Really, the geographic boundaries have come down, and it's very easy for businesses to do businesses in the other countries. Having that global vision, and having global vision really means companies must have the ability to recognize and react to those international business opportunities, but at the same time being aware of the threats of foreign businesses doing business in Canada. Also means having some really strong distribution networks that are able to distribute goods to foreign countries and at the same time move raw materials from halfway across the world to Canadian businesses as well. So having a global vision is no longer an option, but is an imperative for many businesses to succeed in today's markets. As I said, Canada has always been deeply involved in importing and exporting. And that really has led to Canada having one of the highest standards of living because trade enhances the quality of life in Canada. We take a look at the global markets. It's easy to see why it's important for Canadian businesses to do business internationally. Canada has about 34.5 million people, which is relatively small compared to the almost 7 billion customers that exist in 195 countries across the world. And in fact, 60% of the world's population lives in Asian markets. In North America, combined, is only about 5% of the world's population. Some of the other bigger markets are China and India, where about a third of the world's population lives. So it's easy to see how easy it is to expand your market by doing business internationally. In addition, international business creates a lot of jobs in Canada. It's estimated that about 20% of all Canadian jobs are directly related to international trade. By exporting and, of course, importing goods into Canada, it allows a lot more consumer choice for Canadians. So by importing goods from other countries, we have a lot wider range of, and choice of products. And as well, competition from global competitors have created innovation in products and allowed Canadians access to a lot more product suite, and at the same time, because of the increased competition, kept prices low. So it's really easy to see why it's important for Canadian businesses to do business internationally. The global market is truly dynamic. It's changing all the time. And progressive companies continuously scan the business environment to ensure that they do take advantage of those global opportunities, and at the same time minimizing the impact of the threats from global competition. Multinational companies or corporations that move resources, goods, and services and skills across national boundaries without any regard for where the head office is located. So there are many Canadian multinational companies. Magna International is a very large one, Koch Corporation, Bombardier, and most of the financial institutions today have are multinational companies, and they have offices located in foreign countries. Multinational companies do have some advantages and can overcome some of the problems that other businesses experience in doing business internationally. One of those advantages is that they're able to better manage regulatory controls. Sometimes governments may have prohibition or some trade restrictions on importing goods, and hence by producing and having a head office in another company can help overstep some of those road barriers. One of the other advantages of multinational companies is they can shift production from one place in the world to another place in the world quite easily. If they've got plants located in Canada, Brazil, Europe, all over the place. As markets change, they can shift production to those markets and deliver better to consumers. By having headquarters and businesses located all over the world, companies can better take advantage of some of the new technology that's being created in those other countries. They can also find it easier to adapt to the market. They're aware of cultural and local regulations and trends and preferences for the consumers or potential customers. And as well, multinational companies can often save a lot in labor costs by having some of the work done that perhaps requires lower skills done in countries where the costs of labor are relatively low. So there's a couple of terms that you need to be familiar with when measuring the level of trade with other nations. We've already talked about exports, and exports are when a country sells goods that are produced in Canada outside of the Canadian borders. So as we say, Canada is a net exporter of goods and services, and about 3/4 of our exports are to the United States. Small businesses in Canada have a significant impact to the export market. So while small business accounts for just under half of the private labor force, they actually do produce almost 85% of exports in Canada. So small businesses have a huge role to play in exporting goods and services outside of Canadian borders. Canada is also a very large importer. An importer is when goods and services that are produced abroad are brought into Canada and are sold in Canada. So Canada is also a very large importer of goods and services. The balance of trade and the balance of payments are two ways that we can measure the levels of trade, and we'll take a look at those terms on the next slide. One way of measuring the level of international trade is something that's called the balance of trade. And the balance of trade really is the difference between the country's exports and the value of the imports during a certain period of time. And when a country exports more than it imports, it's said to have a favorable balance of trade, or sometimes called a trade surplus. And if a country imports more than it exports, it has an unfavorable balance of trade, or a trade deficit. As we said, United States is our largest trading partner. About 74% of exports go to the United States. And we import about 63% of what we import comes from the United States as well. So the United States is our largest trading partner, and that's been one of the challenges, because we have relied extensively on the United States for our international trade. And as we've seen in the 2008 and even the 2011 financial troubles in the United States, that has a significant impact on Canada, because when the economy in the United States is gloomy or declining, it can really affect Canadian businesses. So there's been a lot of emphasis to expand our trading partners to other countries. The Canadian government has spent lots of money and lots of time trying to develop trade relationships with countries like India and China to try and expand our global marketplace in the Asian communities and Eastern communities. And so the level of trade that we're doing with the United States is coming down. Now we're exporting about 73%. Just a few years ago, we were probably exporting, 82 to 85% of our goods and services, 10 years ago to the United States. So Canadian businesses are looking to other international markets as well. Canada is, in terms of balance of trade, is a net exporter. So we have a favorable, or a trade surplus. Another way to measure the level of international trade is something called the balance of payments. And the balance of payments just doesn't account for imports and exports, but accounts for all sources of money that go in or out of a country. So, and the balance of payments is the difference between money coming into a country from exports and money leaving the country for imports, plus money other flows, such as other things like tourism, foreign aid, military expenditures, foreign investment. So the balance of payments measures all sources of cash flow, money flow between countries. If we take a look at this slide shows the amount of payments, or money that flows in and outside of Canada with these other trading partners. So for instance, so this is on a balance of payments basis, not on a balance of trade basis. So the United States, you can see, is our largest trading partner. The value of exports, about almost $270 billion of our total $405 billion in exports has been with the United States, and about 63% of our imports coming from the United States as well. So our other larger trading partners are, of course, Japan, the United Kingdom, other European Union countries, and we'll talk a bit more about that, and other developed countries throughout the world. So as we see, Canada ranks worldwide about 11th in imports and exports, and again, our largest trading partner is the United States. Canada traditionally has been a large exporter of natural resources, things like energy, forestry, softwood lumber, agricultural products, fishing products. Those are the largest exporters or exports that Canada produces. And similarly, our largest imports are pretty much the same thing. While we export one form of energy, we might import another form of energy as well. And same thing with agricultural products and even fishing products. So it's interesting to take a look at what our exports and imports are. They're often very much the same, just different types of products. So Russia, China, India, Brazil are becoming more important as target market for exports, as I mentioned earlier. These countries have been expanding. They're growing rapidly, and they have a large population base that provides lots of opportunity for Canadian businesses. So hence some of the trade delegations going to those countries to try and promote international trade. It's important to understand some of the current challenges that Canadian exporters and Canadian businesses are having with respect to the global markets. First of all, the 2008 and 2011 economic crises, which were particularly strong in the United States compared to Canada, really caused some concern for manufacturers. Because the United States is our largest trading partner, it's been said that when the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold, which is really true because as we saw from the economic crisis of 2008 and 2011, the level of money and exports was truly affected by the sluggish U.S. economy. And in fact, Canada historically has had a favorable balance of trade measured on a balance of payments basis. And in 2009, that started to turn around, so that more money we had a trade deficit measured in balance of payments for the first time in many years. And that was really largely part of the economic crisis in the United States. So not only did it decrease demand for Canadian goods and services because our exporters weren't exporting as much, but also that then had some impact on the unemployment rate in Canada because if businesses were not exporting, they were of course laying off people. So it's important to understand how the economic crisis throughout the world, not just the United States, we've seen that in some of our European trading partners as well, can have impacts on Canadian businesses. The second thing that's affecting Canadian manufacturers and Canadian exporters today is the fluctuating value of currencies. So when we talk about the exchange rate is the price of one country's currency in terms of another country's currency. If a country's currency appreciates or gains in value or increases in value compared to another country's currencies, less of that country's currency is needed to buy another country's currency or goods and services, for that matter. If the Canadian dollar depreciates, more money is needed to buy another country's currency. And the appreciation and depreciation, or the exchange rate, can really affect the prices of a country's goods and services. What we've seen lately is that the Canadian dollar has appreciated in value compared to the United States dollar. So maybe 10 years ago, the value of the dollar was in the high 60s or low 70s cents. So what that meant is that Americans could buy Canadian imported goods, so goods exported out of Canada, cheaper than they could buy some American goods. So that was very good for manufacturers because Exports were very strong because of the difference in the exchange rate between the Canadian and US dollar. Over the last several years, we've seen an appreciation in the value of the Canadian currency. So Americans had to pay more money to buy Canadian-produced goods and services, and that made it very difficult for Canadian manufacturers to do business in the United States, to export goods and services to the United States, because it drove up the price. By doing nothing else, except the change in the currency rate or the exchange rate caused goods and services in Canada, or produced in Canada, to become more expensive for Americans to buy. And so that has been a huge learning for Canadian manufacturers, to have that external force affect their business. The exchange rate in Canada works on a system called a floating exchange rate. So the demand and supply that we learned about in Chapter 2 of the Canadian currency drives the price up or down. With some of the economic crises happening in Europe and happening in the United States, the Canadian dollar has appreciated in value. So that means international investors have been wanting to invest more money in Canada, whereas before they might have invested in some other countries, the United States, for instance. And so that's driven up the demand for the Canadian dollar. And as we learned in Chapter 2, when demand increases, it drives up the price. So the value of the Canadian dollar compared to other currencies has appreciated and gone up. So this floating exchange rate can have effect on Canadian manufacturers and all Canadian businesses that are exporting goods and services outside of Canada. So international trade generally is a good thing for the world, and it makes sense to trade with other nations. No one country can produce all the products that people want and need. For instance, if Canada wants to drink coffee in the morning, or Canadians want to drink coffee in the morning, they're going to have to import coffee because we can't produce it here in Canada. So by trading internationally, we can increase the standard of living and quality of life in Canada. Nations who can't produce what they want, they will need to trade with countries who can. Some countries have an abundance of natural resources, but lack the technological know-how to either retrieve them or develop them or turn them into a good business opportunity. For instance, countries like Russia have an abundance of natural resources, but perhaps lack some of the know-how or the entrepreneurship to develop those. So it makes sense for countries that have those natural resources to export them and buy completed goods and services. Other countries have technology, but they don't have the natural resources. For instance, like Japan. Japan has the technology and the know-how, but do not have the same level of natural resources as, say, Canada, the United States, or some of the as Russia does. So it makes sense for them to import those natural resources and produce products and export those products. There's two theories on why nations trade as well. Let's take a look at the absolute advantage theory. A country is said to have an absolute advantage when it can produce and sell a product at a lower cost than any other country can in the world, or when it's the only country that can provide that product. Canada has an absolute advantage compared to other countries in the world over things like softwood, lumber, some technologies, and can produce that good or service at a lower cost than any other country. So the absolute advantage theory says that countries that can produce it at lower cost should produce those products and buy from other countries or import other goods and services that it can't produce as efficiently. By doing that, we can increase the overall wealth in the world, and it makes sense then that the standard of living across the world would increase, and we would use our resources the most efficient way possible. The principle of comparative advantage states that a country should sell to other countries those goods that it can produce most effectively and efficiently, and buy from other countries that it cannot produce as efficiently or effectively. So Japan, for instance, has a comparative advantage with respect to cars and electronics. And Canada might have a comparative advantage with respect to things like forestry products again, aluminum, other metals, perhaps even hydroelectric power. So if countries produce those goods and services that they have a comparative advantage in, and trade for all the rest, again, overall world resources are used more efficiently, and worldwide wealth is maximized. So as we've seen, doing business internationally can have some huge advantages for Canadian businesses. You know, we've talked about the sales growth, their expanded markets, increased world economic well-being. It creates a better choice for consumers, and prices kept in check with increased competition. Other advantages of global trade are, that it inspires innovation for new products, keeps firms challenged, and really makes them have to be more efficient with the use of their resources. And the flow of capital between countries gives access to money that's outside of Canada, and helps keep interest rates low, and can increase the economic growth in the country. So there's been a lot of movement towards free trade, and free trade means the unrestricted movement of goods and services across international borders. There are some businesses, though, who fear this concept of free trade and doing business internationally. One of the fears is a loss of jobs with a shift of work to foreign countries, where labor rates are lowers. Sometimes workers fear reduced salaries and wages if employers threaten to move their operations to lower cost markets where they can produce goods and services more cheaply. There has been a loss of, or a fear of loss of service and white-collar jobs if operations are moving overseas as well. And the fear that employers may threaten to export jobs if there are labor disputes in Canada. So there are some challenges or fear of having a free trade corridor between the United States and other parts of the world as well. So we've talked about these benefits of globalization, which are some of the reasons that countries should trade internationally. So despite some of the fears of doing business internationally and having a freer movement of goods and services across international borders, it has been recognized that the benefits of globalization have generally outweighed the costs or disadvantages of freer trade. So what's happened is a common market, or a trading bloc, is a group of countries that have a common external tariff or no internal tariffs, and as well a coordination of laws to facilitate the exchange between member countries. And one of the most well-known of those is the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. NAFTA was an agreement that created a free trade area between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And it came into effect on January the 1st, 1993. And the purpose of NAFTA was to eliminate the trade barriers between those three countries and facilitate the cross-border movement of goods and services. It was also, one of the goals was to promote conditions of fair competition in this free trade agreement and allow for increased investment opportunities between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. One of the other purpose of NAFTA was to still provide some effective protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights in each nation's territories. And another benefit of NAFTA was to improve working conditions in North America. So it really opened up the markets. Although there were fears that the NAFTA would lead to employment losses, and we wouldn't, in fact, see some of the economic benefits. That really hasn't proven to be the case. Since NAFTA came into effect, trade and investment levels have increased, and we've seen strong economic growth in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, as well as better pricing. So there hasn't been a huge shift of labor down to Mexico, which is one of the fears of NAFTA. Another common market or free trade area is something called Mercosur. So this is really the trading bloc that we see in South America. And again, it encourages free trade between Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela. We have similar common markets that have developed in the Asian countries. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which was created in 1967, it was developed to promote freer trade between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. And this is an area that Canada is looking towards doing more business in. And so in 2010, Canada, the government of Canada signed an agreement to enhance our trading relationship with the ASEAN community, with the hopes of doing more business with those Asian countries. You've probably all heard of the European Union. So the EU began really in the late 1950s as an allegiance of 6 countries in Europe. And currently it has about 27 countries in Europe that belong to the European Union. European countries are typically smaller, and so you can imagine before the common market, it was very difficult to shift or move goods and services across the border. We were dealing with different trade regulations. We'd have to go through customs every time. We'd have to exchange currencies. There might be, each government had different import and export regulations. So it made sense to reduce some of those barriers. And it really has become one of the world's biggest trading partners. And in fact, the European Union instituted a common currency in 1999 called the euro to eliminate some of the problems with the exchange rate. So the EU has created some economic progress in European countries and is, again, another large common market in the world. So here we can see the countries that belong to the EU. There's 27 member countries, and other countries are looking at joining the European Union as well. So by now, hopefully you recognize the importance of, for Canadian businesses to do business internationally, how it can increase profits and increase the standard of living for Canadians living in Canada. So how do you go about entering the global marketplace? There are, your textbook outlines 5 different strategies to enter the global marketplace. Those are exporting, the second is licensing and franchising, third is contract manufacturing, joint ventures, and direct foreign investment. As we move from left to right on this graph, the level of risk increases with each of those. So exporting is the lowest risk, whereas direct foreign investment, we'll see, has the highest risk. However, you'll recall that risk-return trade-off we talked about in Chapter 1. The more risk we take, the higher the potential are for higher returns or higher profits. So many companies start out in exporting and may move up through this as they become more comfortable with dealing in international markets. So in the next slide, let's take a look and understand each of these 5 strategies for doing business internationally. The first and lowest risk way is through exporting. And exporting, as we said, is doing business, producing businesses in Canada and selling Canadian-produced goods and services abroad. This is the lowest risk, and by selling directly to foreign countries, which many small businesses do. So many small businesses in Canada sell directly to foreign countries. It's a huge way to open up markets. Lower risk, and one of the higher risks of doing business through exports is sometimes collecting payments. So if we're selling to a company in China, for instance, how do we ensure that we will receive payment for those goods and services? There are different laws, and if they don't pay, it's very difficult to collect on those payments. So there are many ways to counteract that risk. You can work with your local bank to buy letters of credit, which is a way to ensure payment after shipment of goods to a foreign country. Countries today are learning to, companies today in Canada are learning to deal with the risk of a different floating exchange rate. They may sell based on a certain price, and then when they collect the payment, the exchange rate may have moved, so they could actually lose some money or reduce their profits. So there are some mechanisms that you can work with financial institutions to fix the exchange rate when payment is received. So exporting is a very viable option for Canadian business wanting to do business internationally. Licensing and franchising is another way, and licensing really is a legal process where the licensor or the Canadian company agrees to let another company use their manufacturing processes or trademarks or patents to produce goods and services. For instance, in the Philip Morris company in the United States licensed Labatt's in Canada to produce Miller High Life beer in Canada. So you provided a license to a Canadian company to produce their goods and services. One of the risks of licensing is that if you've provided a license and provided the trade secrets to another country outside of Canada, you need to have certain controls to ensure that they are producing the same quality, are fair in pricing, and that they don't void the licensing agreement and start producing your good in their market on their own. So many companies can counter that risk by manufacturing some of the critical components that are used in the production of goods and services abroad in Canada. We'll talk a little bit more about franchising in Chapter 8, but it really is a form of licensing, kind of like a business-in-the-box concept. And that explains why we see McDonald's located in many countries throughout the world. That is a way of doing business internationally through franchising. In contract manufacturing, a foreign company manufactures private label goods under a domestic company's brand. So we might see some contract manufacturing done where, for instance, Nike shoes are produced in other parts of the world. In fact, Nike really doesn't have manufacturing plants per se. It has licensing arrangement or contract manufacturing arrangements where foreign companies will manufacture their goods and services. So one of the advantages of contract manufacturing is that it really lets a country test the markets. It will allow a company to experiment in a new market without really incurring heavy startup costs, such as building a manufacturing plant, because we're using the manufacturing services of another foreign company. Sometimes contract manufacturing is also known as outsourcing when it comes to manufacturing. Joint venture is a partnership in which two or more companies join to undertake a project and form a new company. So a Canadian company and a foreign company will combine together to operate a new entity or a new company. And some of the advantages of international joint venture can be, where the two different companies will share technology, they will share the risk, they will share the marketing and management expertise. It'll often allows Canadian companies to get into foreign markets when there are some trade restrictions. One of the advantages of joint ventures as well is that a Canadian company can gain knowledge of the local markets, the local customs, government connections, access to local skilled laborers and supplies, and awareness of domestic laws, regulations, and market shifts and trends. So it can be a good way to enter into another market. The highest risk, or the most risky, but having the highest profit potential, is direct foreign investment. And direct foreign investment is when we actually set up a manufacturing plant in another country. So a Canadian company might create a production plant in a foreign country to produce goods and services. This is the highest risk because it has a lot of capital investment in another country, and not so easy to undo it if it's not as successful, but it can have the highest returns. Counter trade is a form of international trade when part or all of the payment of goods and services is done in the form of other products. So money perhaps is in exchange, but they trade goods and services for other goods and services. Recognizing the importance of doing business internationally, governments as well as some financial organizations have been created and work hard to increase global trade. One of the things that most countries, and most developed countries, have instituted are anti-dumping laws. And dumping is the practice of selling products in a foreign country at a lower price than it's charged in the producing countries. So countries will sometimes use this tactic to reduce surplus products or to gain a foothold in a new market. Dumping benefits the foreign firms as they intentionally charge lower prices in a foreign country to generate more sales. And it also benefits purchasers in the domestic country because they can buy products at a lower price. And the problem is that domestic producers of competitive goods and services do not benefit. And dumping often leads to lower prices, which can damage the domestic industry by leading to less revenues and potential job losses. We saw this probably in the 1970s or so with the television market in the United States. A lot of color television products or television sets were produced in the United States. And what happened is there was a Japanese companies were producing similar color televisions, and they dumped the surplus supply that they had into the United States market. So U.S. citizens could purchase a Japanese produced television set much cheaper than they could buy a television set that was produced in the United States. And effectively what happened is it destroyed the industry for the production of television sets in the United States. So today, most television sets are actually produced in some of the Asian countries, and that crippled the television set production manufacturing industry in the United States. So it took a while for the government to recognize what was happening, and it led to some anti-dumping laws to prohibit that in the United States. The World Trade Organization is an organization that was established in 1994 to really oversee international trade and reduce trade barriers between countries and resolve some of the disputes that member nations were having with respect to international trade, and really leads to opening up of the markets. And the reduction of some of the trade barriers, and we'll talk a little bit more about trade barriers in a minute, greatly influences world trade. A recent example of the World Trade Organization becoming involved in resolving disputes was in the Canada-US software lumber disputes that were happening, probably about 5 years ago now. The United States was charging penalties or fees for the importation of softwood lumber products from Canada into the United States, and it resulted in complaints to the World Trade Organization, who found that the United States was acting illegally and charging these fees and penalties or tariffs on imported software. And the World Trade Organization required the United States to pay back millions of dollars of those fees and penalties that were collected to Canadian businesses. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are organizations that are really meant to offer either low interest loans to developing nations to allow them to trade with international companies, or in case of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, it was created in 1945, and it makes short-term loans to member nations that really are struggling to meet their payments to foreign countries. So it'll give emergency loans to countries to allow them to pay their foreign companies bills per se, and in fact ensure that markets remain open between international companies. To be successful in foreign market, Canadian companies must really understand the foreign environment in which they plan to operate. Things like politics, cultural differences, the economic environment can often represent pitfalls in the global marketplace. As well, there are some obstacles to international trade, and we'll talk about things like natural trade barriers and tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers that are will all restrict the level of international trade. Governments can use many tools to restrict trade, and the political structure of a country can influence Canadian company success when dealing with a foreign business. For example, intense nationalism can cause some difficulties. Nationalism really is a sense of national pride, and countries such as Iran have a very strong sense of nationalism, so they in fact discourage foreign investment in Iran and look upon it negatively. Canada has some some sense of nationalism in certain industries as well. For instance, the Canadian Radio Television Telecommunications Commission, CRTC, has a form of quota system whereby radio stations in Canada are required to play 35% Canadian content music during the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Mondays to Friday. In the extreme example is when a foreign government might expropriate foreign companies' assets or confiscate those assets, which can certainly affect a Canadian multinational company. It's also important to understand the cultural differences that exist when dealing with international companies. And culture really refers to the set of values, the beliefs, rules, religion that is held by a certain group of people. And that includes language. And so it's really important to understand the sociocultural forces in a foreign country. For instance, if doing business in China, it's important not to stare in the eyes of the Chinese business person you're doing business with. And in China, it's really important to get to know each other before doing business, and they spend a lot of time on social interactions before actually doing any business. It's really important in China to be punctual and go through negotiations slowly. Don't use the hard sell approach or high-pressured sales tactics. Dress conservatively. It is a more formal environment, so don't use first names, for instance. When presenting a business card, it's suggested to present the business card with both hands and with the printing facing towards the person that you are presenting it to. Often it's important to use gold ink, which is a color of success in China, on your business cards. Many companies have, well-known companies, in fact, have done not so great of a job in understanding the cultural differences or the language differences in dealing in international companies. For instance, in 1988, GE, General Electric Company, formed a new telecommunications company and what that was a company that was doing business in Europe, and it was called GPT. And in France, GPT is pronounced GPT, and which means I farted. So it didn't have the desired effect. Gerber, which is a famous baby food maker in Canada, doesn't exist in France as well, because Gerber is the French word for vomiting. So it didn't do so well over there. When Ford introduced the Pinto car in Brazil, Pinto apparently is Brazilian slang for small male genitals, so apparently they renamed the car Corcel, which means horse or steed. Your textbook talks about when Coca-Cola was first introduced in China, the printed signs in the Chinese characters read "Bite the wax tadpole," which didn't go over so well. Coors used a slogan when dealing with some of the Spanish-speaking countries. And they used the slogan "Turn it loose," which was read as "Suffer from diarrhea." So that didn't go over well. So those are some examples of how important it is to understand the cultural environment that you're dealing with. It's also important to understand the economic environment. Are you dealing with the command economy? Are you dealing with a country that is going through a recession? Understanding the country's banking system or financial institution system, how strong is it, how stable is it, and along with that goes to understand the infrastructure in a foreign country. So understanding the economic situation or a lack of understanding of the economic situation can affect Canadian businesses as well. Natural barriers to trade can be either physical or cultural barriers. For instance, distance is one natural barrier to trade. Sometimes it's not practicable to trade in a good or services just because of the distance that's involved. For instance, selling or shipping the coal from Canada's north to Australia may not make sense because of the costs involved in doing that. Some of the other natural barriers to trade might be language differences, cultural differences, differences in laws and regulations that might restrict the amount of trade. Some countries actually purposely practice protectionism, and protectionism is the use of government regulations to limit the import of goods and services to a country. And there's very reason some countries will practice protectionism to protect their manufacturers or the businesses in their country, to protect jobs, to sometimes allow for industries that are just starting out to gain a foothold in the market as well. And trade protectionism often will increase the cost of products to consumers, and while protecting some fledgling companies or industries that are having problems, allow them to grow. As well, by introducing tariffs, it is a form of revenue for the government. So there are tariffs that are introduced, and tariffs really is a tax on a good or service that is being imported into the country. There are also a number of non-tariff barriers to trade that governments can use to restrict international trade. One of those is import quotas. This is a limit on the amount of goods or services that can be imported into a country, and the goal is to set a limit on a given product, perhaps to protect an industry within the country. For instance, the United States had at one time import quotas on the amount of textile products that could be imported into the United States. Another non-tariff barrier to trade is an embargo. It's a complete ban against importing or exporting a product into the country. Canada has embargoes on certain exotic animals and goods produced with exotic animal skins are not allowed to be brought into Canada. Canada doesn't allow the export of any military goods to countries that threaten our security. It wouldn't make sense to sell our know-how or export military weapons to a country that could represent a threat to Canadian citizens. Sometimes there are customs regulations which forces any goods being imported into a country to conform to certain standards. For instance, goods imported into Canada from the United States must be measured or labeled in liters as opposed to gallons or quarts, as they are in the United States. So the bottles have to be on liter size rather than quart size. Often, as well, if goods or services are being imported to Canada, they have to meet labeling considerations and being labeled in French and English, and meeting the requirements that the Government of Canada has on labeling goods and services. So important to understand any of those type of customs regulations. Some countries have exchange controls, which requires a country to exchange currency in a central bank, for instance. And that, in that way, the foreign government can control the amount of goods and services that are coming into the country as well. So there's a number of ways that governments can restrict the level of international trade. But as a general rule, we're seeing a breakdown of some of those tariff and non-tariff barriers to international trade, particularly in the free trade corridors that we talked about earlier. So going forward, we're certainly going to see more presence of Canadian businesses in international trade. Canada's got a very strong banking system, which is envied around the world, and has a good reputation for doing business internationally. And we've outpaced many other countries in things like energy, mining, financial services. So we'll see Canada becoming a bigger player in the global arena. We've also seen instances where the government of Canada is trying to develop new markets, particularly with some of the Asian countries in India, and having some trade alliances with those countries. So we'll see more and more of that as we go forward, as Canada wants to break into some of those new markets. We'll certainly start to see stronger economic power shifting to countries like Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These countries are growing strong. They've got strong GDP growth and huge potential for business for Canadian companies. And in fact, it's predicted that China is going to be the biggest economy in the world, in between 2030 and 2050. So important to understand that and to take advantage of those opportunities.